Thanks for joining us today. I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion. I'm Mike Salito. I'm the Deputy Director of Stanford High. Before we get started, I wanted to recognize a milestone for HAI. This is the 100th online event we've hosted since the beginning of COVID. And I really wanted to thank HAI's events manager, Celia Clark, for putting all these events together. It's a massive effort, and 100 events over just over a year is a really impressive and significant amount of work. So I'd like to welcome you today to our panel on the European Commission's recent legal framework, proposed legal framework to regulate artificial intelligence. For those of you who have not read the extensive AI Act proposal, I think it's about 109 or so pages. We've created a summary explainer, which you can find on our website, and there's also going to be a link in the chat, which will distill things down into just a few pages. Next, I want to introduce our panel of experts here. Dr. Andrew Embry is a senior fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology. From 2013 to 2017, he served in the Policy Planning Office at the Department of State, where I had the pleasure of working with him. And he's the co-author of a forthcoming book, The New Fire: War, Peace, and Democracy in the Age of AI. Ambassador Karen Kornbluh is Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund and Director of the GMF Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative. From 2009 to 2012, she served as the US Ambassador to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. And before that, she worked as a policy advisor to then Senator Barack Obama. Dr. Werner Stengg is a cabinet expert in the Office of Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager. His portfolio includes digital matters, including platform policy, data economy, and artificial intelligence. From 2006 to 2019, he served in various units across the European Commission, dealing with e-commerce, online platforms, and public interest services, among other issues. And our moderator today is Marietje Schaake. She is the HAI International Policy Fellow and also Policy Director at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center. Marietje is also president of the Cyber Peace Institute. From 2009 to 2019, she served as a member of the European Parliament, where she was known for her work on cyber and other technology issues. Finally, before turning it over to Marietje, I'd just like to thank our co-sponsors for the event, Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, the German Marshall Fund, and the Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative. If you're interested in signing up for any of our newsletters, we're going to put some links in the chat. And I, again, want to thank our co-sponsors for helping us pull this event together. With that, I'll turn the floor over to Marietje.
Thank you so much, Mike. A warm welcome to everybody. First of all, our panelists, but really also everybody who has made time in their mornings, afternoons, or evenings to join us for what I think will be a great discussion on the new EU AI Act. And I just want to echo my gratitude for partnering today with the German Marshall Fund and Georgetown's CSET program. When it comes to technology, Silicon Valley, but also Stanford, are obviously hubs of research, creation, and activity. But when it comes to tech policy, the EU is often taking the lead, and it's great to bring the two together today with, Washington in the geographical middle, but also increasingly, and particularly after this week of summits and the G7 meeting, at the heart of discussions about policy and what is the best way forward to make sure that the technology can be reaped for all its possibilities and opportunities to make people's lives better, but so that harms and risks are mitigated and conflict and escalation is limited. Now, the topic of today, the recently announced EU AI Act, is so far the most comprehensive and large-scale legislative initiative that has been taken. And it means that the world is, again, particularly focused on AI, watching Brussels. And what we're going to do today is to really take you through this complex and comprehensive piece of legislation to make it easy for you to understand the EU AI Act, and also to the extent that it's relevant for you to help you to be a part of shaping it, because it's a legislative proposal. It is not set in stone yet. It will still be amended by members of the European Parliament, but also by governments of each EU member state. The proposal builds on existing EU law and on the fundamental rights approach that the EU has frequently taken, for example, also when it adopted the landmark General Data Protection Regulation. And the aim of the legislative proposal is really to foster economic growth, to ensure that there's harmonization of approaches between the 27 different member states of the European Union, to offer safety and legal certainty for both companies and consumers, and I think the latter part has gotten the most attention, to ensure that there's risk mitigation. The EU wants to build a so-called ecosystem of trust, and in doing so takes a human-centered approach, which is something that we do at the Institute for Human-Centered AI at Stanford as well. Now, this whole risk mitigation approach or risk-based approach means that the AIA ranges from identifying unacceptable applications of AI that should be banned, all the way to low-risk uses of AI where essentially no additional measures are required. And for each category on the spectrum, so in between AI that may have to be banned or AI that is essentially considered risk-free or harmless, the law proposes ways to mitigate risk and harms proportionately. So measures to do so include things like conformity assessments before AI goes onto the market or before it's deployed, but also so-called market monitoring mechanisms to see how an AI application actually works out in practice once it is rolled out for use in society. Now, bans have gotten a lot of attention, and they are proposed, for example, for social scoring systems that could lead to the unjustified treatment or real-time remote biometric identification in publicly accessible spaces. So the most far-reaching risk for the individual as a result of the uses of AI. But then high-risk applications include AI systems that are used for border control or to grant people access, or rather to deny them, access to education and employment. Now, the new legislative proposal has not only been met with applause. Eric Schmidt, for example, has been unequivocally critical of the EU's approach, and he called the proposed transparency requirements a mistake. The full quote was that he said, quote, "The EU did regulation first, and I think that's a mistake," end of quote. While EU leaders themselves actually tend to embrace this role as a regulatory leader. Anu Bradford, whom we have hosted at Stanford before, actually wrote about the way in which the EU exports its standards, regulations, and influence in her book that's called The Brussels Effect, which is now a term that speaks for itself. On the other hand of the criticism that we've heard from Eric Schmidt, there are civil society groups, but also the European Data Protection Supervisor, that have concerns that the law at points would not go far enough. They've pointed to potential loopholes that could be exploited, for example, by governments of member states if they want to use AI for surveillance. So very clearly, the last word has not been said about the EU AI Act. There is, and that's the focus of today, a very transatlantic and global angle from which we can look at this AI law. I think that the EU will again enjoy a first mover advantage and can therefore set the tone, cause ripple effects coming from this regulation. And the question is, what does it mean for relations with the United States and other countries around the world? Now, we just come out of a week during which the G7 met. There was an EU-US summit. There was also a meeting between Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden. And all of these important meetings did have a strong focus on technology governance, risk mitigation, but also a stronger emphasis than ever before on the need to have democratically based governance to really, anchor the technological developments and also risks and escalations that are unfortunately part of that technological revolution. I'm happy that in this important week, we have a great set of expert speakers. I welcome them again. I won't introduce them because Mike has already done so. But we will also have enough time for interaction after the panel and the introductory remarks. I'll come back with a few questions. There could be responses between the panelists, and the floor will be open for questions from you, the audience. Please type them into the Q&A and I will get to you as quickly as I can. But for now, we'll start with Werner Stengg for his introductory remarks. Werner, over to you.
Thank you very much, Marietje, and good morning, everybody. It's very easy to talk after you because I've never seen such a succinct and precise summary of what we have done. So you spared me quite some talking, actually. Probably just three major points. The first one is, and you ended with that probably, which was the sort of the democratic legitimacy that we want to give to technology and to companies using technology. That's a super important point for us because digital technology is bringing lots of advantages to our economy and society. We would agree with that, obviously, but all of that has taken a turn whereby it's no longer in the hands of democratically elected governments to decide what type of internet we want and all the societal and economic effects that come with it. And with technology coming very close to each and every one of us in the way our lives are, conducted, we may or may not be discriminated against, and things like that. That just merits a close look by democratically elected people. Second comment is on the interrelationship between innovation and regulation. Because of course there's often this sort of, and Eric Schmidt sort of alluded to that as well, and others did so as well. Europe starts to regulate, and we will stifle the development of artificial intelligence in Europe, and we will fall even further behind the United States and China. We think this reasoning is flawed. There is no contradiction between innovation and regulation in our sense. We also invest heavily in the deployment and development of AI in Europe. We call that the ecosystem of excellence. There's a lot of money going into this and linking up research, investing into skills and training and all sorts of technologies. So we want AI to have their place in Europe. Not only for economic reasons, but also societal reasons, because we would all agree that if properly used, AI can do miracles in terms of health policy, in greening the planet, and what have you. So the intelligent use of data obviously can be the answer to many, many prayers. But then there are high-risk use cases where the technology, if not properly used, can put our safety and health at risk, or can put our fundamental rights at risk. And that is something we have to take seriously, and we want to take seriously. But that's already the first decision that we took. We only and exclusively look into those high-risk use cases. So we're not saying AI as a technology is bad or dangerous or needs to be regulated. We are saying we look into a very limited subset of use cases which we have identified as problematic. Other people may disagree, and we have negotiations, as you rightly said, Marietje. But anyway, that's the starting point. Now, if we look into the risk pyramid that you also alluded to, a pyramid by definition is characterized by being bigger at the bottom than at the top. And that's exactly what we do in our proposal. There is only a handful, literally, a number of use cases which we say we don't want to accept in our society. And you mentioned them, actually. Then there is this limited number of high-risk use cases, which are, again, in the area of safety and fundamental rights. Again, you gave examples already. Then there's even a thinner layer where we say there is lower risk, but still we can totally ignore that, where we limit ourselves to transparency requirements. This is when I'm talking with the bot. There's nothing wrong with the bot unless, as long as I know I'm talking with the bot. So we just want to make people aware. Hang on, you're talking to a machine. And then you can say, well, I'm perfectly fine with this. Probably the machine gives me much more intelligent answers, but I should know. And then there is the vast, vast range of AI applications and use cases across the economy that would not be concerned by our friend. Now, if that means stifling innovation, I don't know. We, on the contrary, think it provides the legal certainty that business needs. We had so many meetings, as you can imagine, in the last 18 months with businesses of all sizes and kinds and sectors and what have you. And many of them, including very large ones, said, we need to know the rules of the game. We need to know where the limits are, what is allowed, what is not allowed, how are we supposed to invest millions of euros or dollars into applications or systems. If we don't know whether 6 months later they will be banned or will be considered unethical or what have you. So now if that framework goes through, any company in the world knows in Europe That's the framework, right? If we meet those rules, we are fine. That's my last comment. The rules themselves. What if you are considered high risk? Well, then you have to do the things that are widely accepted globally, at least amongst like-minded countries. There's been no high-level expert group, no international forum, no even big company that would not come to the same sort of principles, saying we need data quality, we need documentation, explainability, record keeping, transparency, human oversight, all the sorts of things that are the things that you have to do in order to comply with the law. Those things, in inverted commas, are widely shared. Everybody knows that's what you've got to do. The only, in inverted commas, difference that Europe makes now is to say, in those limited high-risk use cases, it's not just enough to sign up to some list of principles. You also have to abide by them. And with that, probably I will stop my first intervention. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Werner, also for sort of responding to the most commonly heard concerns. I'm sure we'll come to more of them in a second. Now I would like to pass the floor to Karen, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. This is such a timely and important discussion. I'm going to just try to talk about it. I think my role is to talk about it a little bit from a transatlantic perspective. And I want to pull back a second from the US. We were so shocked by the January 6th events of the invasion of the US Capitol. And that demonstrated to a lot of people, I think, the real world harm that can come if we don't take the challenges of the digital world seriously. And as you were just saying, I think, Werner, we can't rely on private companies to police themselves in all instances. Their incentives are to maximize profits for their shareholders. And in other realms, in the analog world, we have established guardrails, laws and norms, both. They were developed over centuries to balance things like innovation and protections, but they haven't been updated to apply when the activity is performed by machines and data. But if we're thoughtful, of course, we should be able to do this without limiting innovation. And as Marietje said, the US is the first mover here. But just this week, as she also said, the US agreed to begin talks to try to develop some common ground with Europe on a range of new proposals. The US, of course, is more concerned with pushing back against China's rise, but also in promoting democratic values at home and in overcoming policy differences in the tech space with Europe. So a lot of that coordination is going to occur through this new Trade and Tech Council, which is going to have a working group on AI. And the G7 also mentioned this GPI, I think it's called, summit that will occur in November, which is a G7 initiative housed at the OECD to promote responsible AI. So as we have these talks, the proposed EU legislation provides a model for a nuanced, interoperable framework that we can begin discussing. And, GDPR was brought up before, and I think it's really notable that GDPR has had this global impact, but in the US, it wasn't adopted whole hog. Many in the private sector adopted it. Some states are borrowing from the framework and implementing it in their own way, most recently Virginia. So as we think about how the EU rules might apply globally and in the US specifically, I just have a couple of quick observations. First, the model, overall, the model of creating a new coordinating body of regulators, enhancing transparency, and approaching the problem through a risk perspective are all extremely important. In the US, we have this debate every once in a while about whether we should create a new regulator for digital, but the existing regulators we have are not sufficiently staffed to handle these complex new digital challenges. So the idea of a coordinating body is just really interesting, and I think we should think about that in the US. Transparency is obviously essential. It's really embraced in the US because there shouldn't be a conflict with the First Amendment, with free expression. And it's great that there will be these compulsory transparency obligations for AI that interact with humans, that detect emotions, and so on. But the devil is really in the details on transparency, because the kind of transparency that's actually useful to people is not always obvious. Ellen Goodman who's a non-resident senior fellow with GMF, has done a whole study about the kinds of labels in social media, for example, that are effective and that aren't. And of course, in AI, explainability becomes this even greater issue. And then just 1 minute on risk. Risk was traditionally treated really differently in the US and the EU, but I think maybe we're moving towards each other in how we think about it. You know, in the EU, at least in the US, we think of the EU as having this precautionary principle where everything is evaluated a priori. The US, we tend to do it after the fact, unless it's a so-called regulated industry like drugs. But GDPR was in many ways risk-based, and as I said, later versions of it have been adopted here. Just a couple of other quick things. The real-time remote biometric identification systems for law enforcement. In the US, we've seen companies collecting biometric data and selling it to law enforcement. So that's one loophole, I think, to think about. Also, the EU proposes assessing the use of AI predictive analytics in high-risk areas like those used for policing and criminal justice, employment, credit, so on. We're getting such an awakening in the US about the systemic problems in so many of these industries that beg for fixing before we automate them. And to call in another researcher who's a non-resident fellow with GMF, Rashida Richardson, has written about a number of possible solutions that we could have to some of this. And these may be more applicable in the US than elsewhere. But just to give you some data, in the US, NIST found that Black, Brown, and Asian people were up to 100 times more likely to be misidentified than white male faces. 3 Black men have already been wrongfully arrested based on false facial recognition match. After a study of Amazon's recognition found that it misidentified 28 members of Congress as criminals, Amazon imposed a moratorium, which they've just extended. And then just the one last thing is the operational challenges that are so great for governments, but also for companies themselves in enforcing guardrails or monitoring. And it's going to take investment. I mean, this is really going to take investment in capacity, training, explainability, to ensure that developers and workers at the point of use, government level, everyone can provide oversight. And also in people, so that they understand what the AI is and how to understand the explanations. But I'm really confident that by working together as democracies, we can take advantage of the opportunities of the AI revolution while protecting civil and fundamental rights. Doing so obviously is going to require new governance institutions, and mechanisms. And it's great that we're having this discussion to start working on these now, because the time is obviously of the essence. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Great points. And it's also great to illustrate some of the risks with real life examples of how minorities have already, it's not a future scenario, but already been wrongfully treated by AI-enabled systems, and how the private sector plays a huge role and sometimes is deliberately used for outsourcing, as we've seen in the past. And again, risks that we can see with companies like Clearview AI, for example, which have prominently scraped the faces of people in order to sell their services to law enforcement. So I think it's great to make this more tangible. Andrew, over to you as the last person who will introduce, and then we'll go to the Q&A session.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with such a distinguished panel, and I'm grateful to Georgetown and Stanford and the German Marshall Fund for sponsoring the event. So I just want to build on some of the really excellent comments from the other panelists, and I also see some great questions in the Q&A that hopefully my comments can partly address. So I want to say a word about a risk that's often overlooked, but I think will prove especially challenging, and then how we can think about effective regulatory cooperation on that moving forward. And then I'll say a word about the transatlantic implications of the regulation and how we can work together in a productive, collaborative way to shape the trajectory of AI consistent with democratic values. So on risks, I do think we often focus rightly on malign use and on accidents that can be involved in technology. But there are also what might be called structural or system risks at scale when the technology is deployed, which are equally important. And these are risks when we introduce AI into complex, tightly coupled systems, or when the technology shapes the environment in ways that creates unintended consequences, perverse incentives or potentially widespread harm. So we have to think about, for example, online, protecting individual rights and privacy, but we also have to think about the ways in which recommendation algorithms and machine learning more broadly can degrade the quality of online discourse and political communication. We have to focus on bias and safety concerns with specific technologies and how they affect specific communities. But we also have to look at the ways in which intensifying geopolitical competition can encourage perverse incentives to deploy AI systems before they're properly tested and before they meet the standards of safety and security. So these are the kinds of system risks that I'm talking about that I do think we need to pay attention to. There are various ways to try to address them. I'd mention just a few. First is I really think we would benefit between the United States and European partners from focusing more on test, evaluation, verification, and validation, and particularly continuous and iterative testing, since so much of machine learning is very hard to predict. These are self-learning systems, so we need continuous investments in iterative testing. It means we need to do more reporting together at the working level on accidents so we can figure out in very practical ways how to de-risk some of these systems. And that will really help move us from the ethereal debates where I think we will sort of disagree sometimes philosophically to much more practical use cases where I think cooperation can be achieved. We need to think about how to share our TE, V, and V procedures with each other and think through implementation challenges on standards and benchmarking performance for these systems so there's policy interoperability. I think that's going to be really important. And there's already good work being done. For me, success on this means eventually mutual recognition of our conformity assessments and finding ways to work together so that we're really building in robustness into these systems from the get-go. So that's one. Another is I think we need to make sure there is expertise and resources for monitoring and assessment at all levels, not just at the federal level or the EU level, but at all levels, because many different actors in this space have different timeframes, different information, and we want to be able to monitor the entire ecosystem for risks. And that's going to be really important that we think through how we do that as we implement these kinds of regulatory approaches. The third is that I really think we need to involve the public now, especially on the implementation side. They need to be socialized to the risks. Different communities have different levels of trust. They have different levels of access to recourse. And so we need to be attentive to the ways in which public support is going to be critical for this. And the final approach I just mentioned is that I do really think that we often think about AI in the abstract, but a lot of this is going to be in the context of human-machine teaming. And so there's a real opportunity to work together on multidisciplinary research on trust in human-machine teaming, how it emerges with what safeguards for what purpose. And so I really think we would benefit from working together on that. Now, in terms of the transatlantic implications, one of the things that I think shines through when we look at the history of technological innovation is that it's not just the innovation itself that matters, but how and why it's used, which means that this really isn't just a question about risks as regards hardware and software, but how we implement our fundamental values. And that means we have to think about values through the life cycle of the technology. And I'm glad to see that the regulation looks at post-market monitoring systems. We have to think about how values are inscribed in the design, development, and deployment of these systems. And that's going to be especially important right now. I know the United States and Europe do have their differences on a whole host of issues, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of that today. But I hope that those differences don't obscure all that we have in common as democracies, that we've worked through many difficult issues before, that we're all in the Democratic camp. President Biden is one of the most committed transatlanticists in generations, and we have an opportunity not just to show that our democracies can deliver, but that we're willing to stand up for the rules-based order that has served all of us, but that is facing real challenges, both from within our societies and from authoritarian countries abroad. Now, I think on that point, one of the challenges and the concerns that I often hear is that authoritarian countries will have certain structural advantages when it comes to AI, that they will be less encumbered by privacy laws, have greater access to large pools of data. They will be able to compel adoption in ways that democracy may not, and they may have greater incentives to accelerate research in this area precisely because of the ability of AI to solve certain problems for authoritarian countries on surveillance and control. And by contrast, I think the received wisdom is that democracies may struggle. They're more haphazard, more decentralized in their approaches, perhaps more encumbered by privacy laws and ethics as they should be, that our companies are more innovative, but that they may spend more of their time focusing on product recommendations and advertising effectiveness, and not on the kinds of products we need for the public good. So I think that's the conventional picture, but I don't think the future is as fatalistic as that might portray. As our research at CSET has shown, the field of AI is malleable, and we can shape it in ways that will be favorable to democratic values and make it harder to wield the technology for authoritarian ends. So I just close with a few examples of how to do this. One is on data. We often talk about how machine learning systems are data hungry systems, and that China may have more data at its disposal. I think the picture is more nuanced there, but there's a whole range of research that we could be investing in on small data approaches to AI that go beyond the data hungry deep learning paradigm. We could be thinking about investing in grand challenges for computing at the edge, computing beyond Moore's law. We could be investing in ways to bring greater interpretability and transparency to these systems, to deal with questions of bias, and to promote nascent areas like privacy preserving machine learning and other privacy enhancing technologies that will allow us to benefit from access to data without compromising the privacy of people who are in the pools of that data. We can also promote innovations that will make it harder for authoritarian uses of this technology, whether that's real-time deepfake detection, bot detection, ways to what's called data pollution to make it harder to track the activities of civil society online. And then there's a whole agenda there that AI will unleash for science, for open innovation. I think one of the challenges in our societies has been we've seen by some measures the rate of scientific innovation slowing. And when we talk about R&D, we often talk about the United States and China, but Europe plays a very significant role in this space. And the United States and Europe together comprise over 50% of global R&D. And that's an exceptional pool that we could try to tap into much more effectively. We've had long-standing challenges on the R&D front, and those persist, but I think this is an area of untapped potential where we could do a lot more together. We've already seen the possibilities for AI on scientific discovery and engineering invention, and we've looked into that at CSET in a whole variety of ways. We've seen the way in which AI has helped predict the 3D structure of proteins to within a width of an atom, and there's a whole range of other opportunities on energy innovation, and on other areas that could be very beneficial to our societies and medical diagnosis and the like. So I think this is a real area where we can come together and promote shared data sets and computing power for researchers in academia, provide greater training in AI to our scientists and engineers, and to think about ways to make federally funded research open and machine readable to researchers in the United States and Europe and the democratic world, to promote innovation and to launch grand challenges that could really push the curve of discovery. So I think we obviously have real challenges ahead. Implementation is going to be key, but I'm optimistic about the prospects, building on some of the recent results from the summits, to move forward in a productive direction.
Thanks, Andrew. Very empowering and looking at opportunities. I think the relief that we can look at constructive ways to make policy interoperable across the Atlantic is significant, but also the urgency is. And I think you're absolutely right to think about both opportunities to solve major societal problems and to make sure that there's not unintended consequences or foreseeable consequences that need to be dealt with. And I like the fact that you talk about we can shape the field within, or the space within which AI is developed, is something that we feel very strongly at Stanford as well, including the need to have a multidisciplinary approach to it. So not just computer scientists, for example, but really people looking at it from all kinds of angles. Now, I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in, and I want to come to as many of them as I can, but also wanted to see if there was a desire on the part of Werner, Karen, and Andrew to respond to each other, maybe going to Werner briefly first to see if he has any thoughts to add about specifically the transatlantic angle, which Karen and Andrew highlighted so much, and which is also a bit of the focus today. So just a brief comment before we go to the Q&A. I'll ask the same to Karen and Andrew after you.
Yes, absolutely. Very, very positive. I mean, in my introduction, I was focusing on the regulation itself, but as we all know, the last few days were much more, we saw much more about the transatlantic relationship, which was very positive. I mean, it started from really top political level, trickling downwards to say, yeah, we want to discuss these things together. We are the most like-minded continents that you can possibly imagine. we have so much in common, so obviously we wanted to work together. That was clear. But that was then operationalized really at the next level by creating this Technology and Trade Council, by agreeing on how to take the next steps. As after the summer break, high-level talks will start. We discuss also the areas where we quite naturally should and will work together. So it's not just talking, but it's really trying to get down to things, say, where exactly can we make a difference? And Andrew referred, for instance, to research, because we're always talking about legislation. Oh, what about the European law on this, that, or the other? Because we also need to discuss this and also principles of AI. But so much more and much more quickly probably can be done to align us much more closely when it comes to research and standardization and what have you. There's so much things we can do together and we will do together. So I'm absolutely in favor and positive about this.
I'll just say one quick thing, Marietje, if I can. I was really struck by Andrew's remarks, and but also awed by how much education and work needs to go on. I used to say in Washington that we had a problem that the wonks, which is what we call policy experts, and the geeks, the techies, don't speak each other's languages. And I think that gap is becoming so profoundly important. And getting people, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, which is this completely overburdened agency that's responsible for so many things, doesn't have the capacity to do all the analog regulating it needs to do, let alone the knowledge and the capacity to take on some of these new issues, and to have, innovative, maybe even AI tools to help them do it. It's so far away from that. And so I hope as we go on, since two of you are at universities, you can talk a little bit about the kind of training we need to do for people as they're coming up, so that the policymakers are cognizant of the technology, the technologists understand that rules don't have to be their enemy and how they can live within them, but how they can shape them. And then, even aftermarket, what do we do for policymakers that are already in those jobs and technologists who are in those jobs?
Thanks for mentioning it. I feel like I have to jump in very briefly because I run a group at Stanford called Wonks and Techies Together with CSET, which Andrew is affiliated with. So it brings together students who care about law, policy, politics, and computer science, technology, and AI. And it's been very fruitful and a fascinating exchange. And I'm very encouraged when people ask me, amidst lots of doom and gloom, what gives me hope? It's often those kinds of students who care to interact exactly at the intersection of policy and technology. And we also finished an executive education for European and American decision makers, politicians, and lawmakers, to familiarize them more with the latest AI developments. And I think the need is great, indeed, and we're trying to fill some of that need, but the pool can definitely be expanded. Sorry to go before you, Andrew, but I felt like I could address these issues right away. Over to you for your last comments, and then I'll start digging into the 22 questions that we have so far.
No, these are all excellent points. I just say a few quick things. One is that I couldn't agree more about how important talent is across the board. And I think in this case, one of the things that will matter is actually supporting teaching and supporting faculty to make sure that this is integrated as students are coming up through the pipeline. We have to think about the future pipeline of our workforce. So supporting teaching, supporting curriculum development and design, not just at the sort of major universities, but across the board in community colleges. I think it will also help to take a broader view of AI talent. There certainly are the sort of the high-end talent that we have, but some of the research we've done at CSET shows that there's a vast array of talent from the product side, management, to data science, to computer science. There's a whole range of talent that needs to be cultivated and integrated into policy discussions. I think one of the best ways to try to do that is to really have concrete, specific problems that are exciting to work on, but also that attract broad talents, a shift in mindset. And I do think, more and more is happening now. More and more people recognize the importance of the intersection of technology and policy. I think time-limited secondments, both in and out of government, can be very beneficial. And also recognizing that the country is bigger than the coast, and at least in the United States, and that we have a whole range of geographic opportunities and possibilities that we want to make sure that we offer to people. And that includes when we think about sharing greater resources for innovation. Often we talk about the importance of shared data sets and computational infrastructure so that we can see more research happening in more places across our communities. And that's going to be vital. That has to be made accessible, not just to industry, but to academic researchers. And again, not just at the major universities, but across the board in all parts of the country. I think that will be really important to bring more people into the talent pipeline. And I just say, I think the United States and Europe really do benefit from each other in this space. We are legitimate economic competitors. We do compete for talent and market share, but we shouldn't, again, let it obscure all that we have in common or the stakes of what's really at play here. And I do hope that we can do more together to encourage even workshops and conferences that bring people together who are real experts in this field and widen participation to, I think, many people who aren't always involved in these kinds of events will really do a lot because I think the less that our biases are correlated and the more diverse our perspectives, I think the better our innovation will be. And so to me, I see, possibilities here to really invest in talent, not just today's, but tomorrow's.
Great points, really, to also democratize the involvement and the understanding of AI, which I think is a challenge for everyone, but has to be broadly ambitious. Great points. Thank you. I'm going to go to the Q&A and start with Jules Salinger, who asked, why isn't there a greater emphasis on, quote, scale of deployment for classification as high risk? Doesn't it make an AI high risk if it impacts, through, though not very much, the lives of millions of people? I'm thinking about largely deployed recommendation algorithms, for example. So not only to look at the risk per se, but also the possible scale at which a system is deployed. I think, Werner, you may want to take a stab at that. There were comments referencing to Articles 6 and 7 of the draft regulation, but maybe you have more to say about the combination of both the risk and the deployment.
Yes, most certainly. I hope you can properly hear me because I have some connection issues here. So I hope it was your problem, not mine. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're coming back, but keep talking.
When you identify high risk, there's of course different ways.
Go ahead.
Okay. Many different ways of identifying high risk management and risk mitigation. We would always start with the magnitude of the risk and of course the likelihood of it coming into place. And depending on where you set the levels, you would include or exclude risks. But point is that if we have not included things in our list of high risk use cases, that does not mean that it is totally unproblematic or unregulated or the Wild West, because either you have very general existing laws in place, whether or not we put the AI regulation on top of it. If there is if there's GDPR regulating privacy, well, that would apply anyway. It may be a bit harder probably to enforce it in the absence of the explainability that we bring in, but still per se, what is forbidden, right? The other thing is that when it comes to algorithms, that we have other pieces of law as well. The Digital Services Act, which we're not discussing today, actually provides for exactly that. And that doesn't have to be AI powered. It just refers to a recommender system based on an algorithm. There may or may not be AI linked to it. But where recommender systems are used, they have to be made more transparent. You need to know why you are seeing things. And you must have a possibility to opt out from any personalized recommender systems. Also in the business with a different piece of law that protects business users of large platforms in providing them with transparency of recommender systems or ranking systems. So if I'm a hotel, I need to understand on what basis Booking.com presents results to the users. So just to say that there is no vacuum just because things are not covered in the AI regulation. I hope you heard it.
Yes, no, thanks. It got better. Second question, I think, could be for anyone who's interested in answering, which is, how do you see regulatory sandboxes? This question is from Eleanor Citron. How do you see regulatory sandboxes being used? Do you think this model is most effective? It's actually also mentioned in the AI Act as a way to help enable innovation. Any thoughts? Karen, do you want to come in, or?
Yeah, I don't have anything profound to say. I think it can be really useful. You know, if we want to try something and do an assessment of how it works, and there's a really thorough and thoughtful assessment, that's a lot safer, I think, than letting it go to scale, and then having, you know, a path start where other things are built on top of it. So I think there's a lot to recommend having sandboxes in this particular area.
Yeah, it's also a way to sort of clear companies from risk that they take by, you know, experimenting. So it's risk mitigation from another perspective to sort of help shield the companies. I'll go to Dr. Emmer Lieser from Leiden University, who says, I'd like to challenge you all, so pay attention, a little bit on the claims of lawmakers, pundits, scholars, and policy buffs that the AI Act is, quote, human-centric. From risk-based regulation, the most EU-favored form of tech regulation, to conformity assessments and prohibitions on certain applications, the AI Act appears to have very little emphasis on the human at its center. Rather, it appears to be nothing more than a product safety measure, and the product is the AI system. Can the panelists please explain in their own words what makes the AI Act human-centric? Maybe Werner wants to start.
I think I have to. Well, I think it's pretty straightforward because, as I said from the beginning, we decided to focus on practical use cases of AI. So we did not regulate the technology as such, but we said there may be circumstances where the use of AI has an impact on our lives, on the lives of citizens, life of human beings, that we want to manage to mitigate or to reduce the risks. That's what makes it human-centric. We're saying if you buy a product and the AI part in that product makes that product more risky for you and your health and safety is at life, that needs to be more strongly regulated. If it affects your rights, I mean, how human-centric can it become? Then saying, well, if my child doesn't get a place at university just because of an AI-powered system allocating students to universities, if I'm not getting a job, if I risk being fired, if I risk not getting a loan from a bank, if I risk being subjected by the police to predictive policing practices and I am arrested more frequently than my neighbor because I happen to have certain personal characteristics. I mean, that for me is the human-centric part of the whole regulation. We want to protect humans from adverse effects of technology.
Thank you. I think that's a good point. Anyone else, or should we go to the next question?
If you don't mind, I had a couple of comments just on some of the good questions that I've heard and building on Werner's comments. I think one step forward that could be helpful is to think through in terms of, how do we foster greater collaboration around effective regulation? How do we think through who should be involved bureaucratically? Who are the right players to actually implement this? In addition to the regulatory agencies, I do think there really is opportunities for an agency like NIST on the US side that's done a lot of work in this space and European equivalents to get together. I think that could foster a really practical conversation. I think there's a role for agencies like the State Department and the Commerce Department. So I think it's a broader conversation than just between the regulatory agencies. And this gets at the point, I think a person asked about regulatory sandboxes. I think what's helpful is if, again, we think about this in practical terms and we do more reporting on risks and accidents so that we actually have use cases that we can talk about as opposed to sort of butting heads in a philosophical sense. I think it's very helpful to sort of have concrete applications and look at where the risks are. I think red teaming functionalities can be very useful to see how these systems break, not just academically sort of in mathematical expression, but also practically as these systems are deployed and we think about different scenarios. Where do we see the risks arise? And I think in the working groups, we can really effectively at an expert level find ways where we agree on where the risks are and how to move them out of these systems. The other thing is there was a comment about the questioner asked about the challenges of scale and some of the risks that we may see there. And obviously one of the big risks of scale is, we've seen a lot of progress in natural language models at scale. And at our organization at CSET, we've just released a study of GPT-3 and its ability to, if provided the right prompts, create disinformation at scale. And we're seeing more and more new technologies posing real challenges for the integrity of democratic discourse online. I mean, we see this with deep fakes, but also just with advances in language models. In our study, we found that it was quite easy to have GPT-3 generate climate change denial discourse, to generate discourse that is in the idiom of conspiracy theories, that could actually persuade audiences that we surveyed. So it's a real challenge for how to protect sort of democratic discourse online when we have these new technologies on the generation side, when the terrain itself is shaped by machine learning, when the lines are blurring between foreign and domestic audiences and the producers and consumers of disinformation. It's an incredibly complicated space, but again, I think this is an area where a greater transatlantic cooperation on whole of society responses, on resilience, on sharing information and best practices, on thinking through ways in which we can red team some of the risks, that we can work together in advance of standard setting conversations in multilateral bodies, could be very, very helpful. And there will be ways in which we can bring the public into this conversation. So we, again, raise their awareness levels and think through the kinds of public alerts, early warning systems, and support for journalism and local investigative work that will be critical as well. So I thought that was an area where scale, as the questioner asked, presents a real risk, but there's paths forward, I think, for effective cooperation.
Great, thanks, Karen.
Yeah, I just want to pick up, Andrew actually addressed it at the end, but I think these conversations can't only be among industry and government and among governments. We have to bring the public in. And we've seen in the debate about social media that not only do people not understand how the social media works, very educated people have no idea how their newsfeed is constructed, but they also don't understand the regulatory backdrop, and they don't understand how other things have been regulated, how regulations might or might not apply. And it's made the conversation much more complicated than it needs to be. So when we've been looking at social media and some of the things to do, we've looked at, I mentioned Ellen's work on labeling. We're about to come out with another paper on design and the user interface, and how can we use some of those prompts, the kinds of things Andrew was just talking about, as tools, not just to inform people about that one individual instance, but also to start to build some muscle about how this stuff works and about the values that are trying to be protected, and just empowering them over the longer run. And I think that's, we have to, the public is paying attention now. They're not trusting elites to solve these problems. They're very suspicious of all the things that technology and governments are doing. Techlash is real. Anti-democratic sentiment is real. And so unfortunately, we have a much higher burden. We have to bring the public in and educate them. And the tools that we develop have to continually bring them in and keep them informed.
Thank you. I think that's really important. The question of agency on the part of individuals that are not inside the companies, that don't have the expertise, but that are still going to be impacted. To me, that's the most sort of human impact question that then translates to many sectors, many instances in which people can be wronged or discriminated against unjustly, and so on. We're really coming up against time, but I wanted to pick up on 2 points that come back in a number of the questions, which is one, a question often heard, also reflected in Eric Schmidt's comments, which is to please provide concrete arguments or references supporting the opinion that regulating AI will not prevent its development and corresponding innovation. It's often said that the regulation stifles innovation, maybe one of the most successful frames coming out of Silicon Valley vis-a-vis lawmakers. But maybe you each can reflect on how you see the relationship between regulation and innovation. It's a broad point around AI, and also maybe include a few thoughts on how regulation can be adaptable or future-proof, as it's called, because of the ever-changing and evolution of AI that is still coming. How do you make sure that it's still relevant and adjustable and not outdated by the time the ink is dry of the whole regulatory process? What I'll do is come back to you in the order of appearance. So Werner, Karen, and Andrew, and you can also just fold in some concluding thoughts before we wrap up.
Yeah, indeed, we're coming back probably to my very first comment, or almost my first comment, when I said that innovation and regulation are not necessarily antipodes. I would, before that, probably even say sometimes there are, however, limits. Yeah, it is not that sort of because something may stifle innovation, everything goes. You know, there are limits, and that's also why we say, well, if our fundamental rights are at stake, for instance, or our lives, then I think there is legitimacy. There would be legitimacy to regulate, even if innovation, some innovation were to be stifled. That's just sort of, innovation is sometimes depicted as a holy cow that you can never ever put in question. Not every innovation is good for society. But that said, I repeat my main argument that intelligent legislation would provide a framework of legal certainty. And then probably another dimension that is typically European, and you alluded to this yourself in introduction. We have 27 member states. They can all regulate in their own ways, as long as we do not regulate at the European scale. If there's risks popping up through technology in different areas, we do see fragmentation. We see different approaches by different member states trying to regulate the same thing, but in different ways. So if we have intelligent, proportionate regulation, and we have one regulatory framework for 27 member states and 450 million people markets, I think that is also very pro-innovation. On the future proofing, that is of course an evergreen topic for all of our tech legislation. In this particular case, I think we've tried, and I thought it was a different question on this indeed in the Q&A section. On the definition, we kept that part pretty flexible when it comes to the real technological, to the techniques that are being developed in the space. We are, in the definition, we cover sort of the type of situation we try to cover with our definition of AI, when AI system using certain technologies helps us take decisions. And those certain technologies would then be, of course, the hardcore AI technologies, and those can be adapted that's legislative technique now, but can be adapted pretty quickly and flexibly. As can, and I thought it was another question, the identification of the use cases themselves, because quite obviously what we put now on our list of what are high-risk use cases, in 3 years from now, we may have totally new ones. And also here we have developed a more flexible mechanism of adapting our law as we go along. Probably last comment on all of this is a huge learning process for us. There's even a link to enforcement and to authorities and to regulatory oversight and all the rest of it, because you can devise the most intelligent and future-proof laws. If the supervisory authorities are not capable of understanding any of this, enforcement of course becomes problematic, which is also why we say, while we go on and learn from applying our laws and try to adapt them to technological process, we have to build capacities out there. And that, of course, I mean, Andrew referred to the general need to invest in skills across the board, but it also extends to policymakers and to regulators and to enforcement authorities. And with that, I would stop it.
Thanks. Karen.
Yeah, what I was thinking about is we used to refer to the states in the United States as laboratories of democracy, that states would try out different kinds of laws, and we would see what worked and what didn't, and they would bubble up to the federal government. And I think in this global economy we're in, different countries serve as laboratories for the kinds of laws and regulations and approaches that we need. And I think that's really encouraging. And I think that's the advantage, that we see of Europe going first, trying out some ideas, or have some discussion, trying to find something in between. But I do think we need innovation in the way we do regulation, that the government is just too slow. it's too slow to pass laws. It's too slow to implement them in regulation. You know, the big innovation of 100 years ago was that we had these regulatory agencies. So the legislature didn't have to do everything. They could delegate to these regulatory agencies that would be more expert. But that is much too slow for today's environment. We need to have a faster way. And, you know, with all due respect, I mean, the European laws that have been unveiled are going to take several years to pass and then to be implemented, and the whole world is going to change. But I certainly can't criticize from the US perspective when Congress has such a difficult time passing any legislation. So this is a bit of an abstract point, but we really need to get better at being quick, at having, you know, let's turn the idea of regulatory sandbox on its head. We need, you know, to try out different regulations and to be able to get a feedback mechanism so we understand, is it sufficient? Is it overbearing? How does it need to be adjusted? And then we need a quick way to adjust it. And we just don't have that today. And it's giving rise to a defeatism about the government being able to address our problems.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's also giving space to companies to basically set standards and rules without, you know, democratic mandate, checks, balances, or oversight. We're running a couple of minutes later, but Andrew, over to you, and then we'll wrap.
Great. Well, I'll just building on the insights of the other panelists, I'll just briefly close with what I think is an important bigger picture context, which is that if we look at the global R&D ecosystem, you know, it's rapidly changing and dynamic. We've seen global R&D triple over the last 20 years, but at the same time, the US share of global R&D has declined, you know, almost 2/3 plus during the Cold War years, and now down to about 25-28%. And that's true for many countries. And I think this puts a premium on thinking about the S&T research ecosystem as a whole. What are our objectives? And then how can we respond, not just as individual nations, but together as democratic nations? And I do think that there's a whole agenda for us to explore. It's not just about the funding. It's also about the infrastructure that we put in place with data and with computing power. It's about the policy and regulatory environment. And it's about human capital development, as we've been discussing. And it's about how to network all of that together to ensure that as these technologies develop, they do so in ways consonant with democratic values. One of the interesting things that I've learned from my colleagues at CSET is to look at collaboration rates on R&D across countries. And the landscape is dynamic and changing, but one of the interesting things is actually the United States is one of the most prominent collaborators of choice for many of the EU 27. And that remains the case. And there's different fields in which we have special expertise, but this opens up the opportunity to do much more to tap the potential of research, which I think has been in some ways a challenge by different auditing requirements, governing laws, you know, data accessibility, privacy, and other things that have made it harder to fully realize this R&D relationship. But there's so much at stake, and there's so much talent on both sides of the Atlantic that I do think this is an area where we can really push now, building on the results of the summits and the re-engagement that we've seen from the Biden administration. And I would just say, stepping back as a final comment, that we hear often that one of the challenges right now is that democracies really need to deliver for their people. And I think one of the central challenges is delivering not just on the economic front with inequality rising, consolidation rising, and not just on the political front where we're all dealing with gridlock and we have to do better on that. It's also proving a proposition that's fundamental, which is that multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, and inclusive democracies really can work and really can thrive in the 21st century digital economy. And I think that's a proposition that needs to be proved through our choices together. And so I think that's why this is such an important conversation and such an important area for us to work together on.
Great, thank you so much. A lot of work to do, a lot of momentum, a lot of urgency. Thank you for sticking with us for 5 more minutes. Thank you for our guests for your enlightening comments. There will be more than the 100 webinars that Celia helped facilitate here at Stanford High with various partners. So join us again to continue our conversation. Thank you.